Hooray! It's Halloween season, which I'm going to use as a flimsy pretext to look at a bunch of indie games that are maybe not spooky in the traditional jump scare Five Nights at Freddy's sense, but still offer some interesting Halloween-y flavor. And first up, I figured I'd ease us into the season with a game that's more action horror than straight up spooky, Daggers, which is a game that's pretty clearly influenced by id and Raven games of old. It's full of skulls, Lovecraftian horrors, twisted dark magic, but none of the tongue-in-cheek action movie bravado or empowered fantasy that Doom or Hexen had. Daggers merges a lot of mechanics from first-person shooters, Doom-style FPS games, with the form and structure of a shoot-'em-up, or shmup, which is just the worst contraction. But you know shmups, typically top-down games where you blast a large number of weak monsters in an enclosed area. Okay, in this context, I mean multi-directional shmups. I know purists might prefer something that looks like this, but we're gonna go with what looks like this because it's relevant and Wikipedia says it still counts as a shmup, so yeah. We can talk about how genre is kinda fluid some other day. And yes, while the difference is obvious to the genre-savvy folks out there, I know shoot 'em up and first-person shooters sound awful similar, and I'm gonna be saying them a lot in this video, so just so we're all clear, shmup, shooter. Shmup, shooter. Okay? Okay. Anyways, at first blush, Daggers is a game that mixes the aesthetic of early id shooter games with gameplay that's closer to shmups like Robochan or Geometry Wars. But it's actually far more infused with that id gameplay style than its Arena and Swarms level design makes it look. For example, monsters have weak spots that need to be hit directly, and since this is a first-person game in full 3D space, it's a much more intense test of aiming than most shmups, which are generally more interested in crowd control. There are two different firing modes that each have pros and cons given distance and the type of enemy you're facing, and since you can always fire both of them, weapon choice is an on-the-fly decision like in a first-person shooter, rather than, say, a power-up or level select option like in most shmups. You can rocket jump by firing at your feet as you leap, and it's often the best way to escape or close a wide distance quickly, and that's a first-person mechanic that doesn't really have an analog in shmups. Even the gem mechanic, which at first looks like a pick up the doodad from the fallen enemies shmuppy thing, results in a mirror of traditional shooter mechanics. As you collect gems, you'll get more powerful weapons and increased visibility with which to fight monsters, but to capture the gems you need to stop shooting. Once you do, they'll be attracted to you, but as you shoot, they're repelled away. This means you occasionally have to stop shooting, and is functionally the equivalent of a reload mechanic that prevents the player from holding down the trigger forever. Another marked departure from most shmups, where fire is only occasionally released, and usually only released in exchange for improved movement. While Daggers might lack the traditional levels of a Doom or Hexen, the pacing is actually really tightly controlled. You tend to get your upgrades at regular intervals, the first shortly after the initial spider monster, and then another after you fight the first snake skeleton thing. Then the final boss shows up around 400 seconds in, and you get the only achievement in the game by surviving for 500 seconds. I guess they assume you killed it if you last that long. After that, you've functionally beaten the game. Daggers has a world record of around 800 seconds, and while you can theoretically keep going beyond that, there doesn't seem to be much more than additional bedlam. And in those 400 to 500 or so seconds of scripted action, there's sort of a set approach to things. Clear the first towers to get your starter gems, then prepare for the first spider skull while keeping in mind the level 3 skull that's about to spawn. After that, prepare for tons of towers leading up to the first worm, and so on. Unlike most multi-directional shmups, these aren't random enemies. The early game has a deliberate spawning pattern that mimics the way levels work in other games. And since these monsters spawn in a given order, choosing which enemy to engage with is a bigger deal here than it is in most shmups. The skulls and tentacles can be casually taken out as you go, but other monsters attack more aggressively, and still others pose an almost immediate threat. There's definitely a concrete order to taking on enemies here, and you need to constantly reassess the situation to make sure you're doing the right thing. There's just so much of that meta shooter stuff going on at once. Weapon selection, enemy focus, your current danger level and the need to move, the need to stop firing and collect fallen gems. The Daggers feels pretty far removed from Geometry War or Waves. Instead, it feels like a condensed version of all the usual first-person staples under the guise of a retro arena shmup. Like, the arena isn't there to act as a nod to shmups, but to act as a sort of final destination, no-items, Fox-only approach to distilling hard, fast-paced shooter mechanics down to their essence without any of the frills. A lot of the time, the game feels sort of like a super concentrated, difficult Destiny strike in a box, and for super quick spats of gameplay that is at once taxing, tense, and frustrating, but somehow rewarding when you come out the other end, I'd highly recommend it. So why bring up an action-y game for Halloween? Well, the iconography, obviously, is a game full of chattering bones and tentacles and demons. But it's the game's tale of Lovecraftian corruption that I think really sells it as a Halloween-y game, even if a more action-y one than a spooky one. I feel it's kind of a good companion piece to In the Kingdom, which would have been perfect for this month had I not already covered it. Both games are tales of elder evils and players seeking power that leads to their downfall. But where In the Kingdom was a tone piece that worked because of its mood way more than the way it played, Devil Daggers is much more systems and gameplay driven, pretty much to the exclusion of all else. And it's neat to see how the story that played out in the Kingdom is kind of also played out in Devil Daggers, though through abstracted systems instead. A lot of this game's story is told through mechanics. Take gems. They grant you power, i.e. weapon upgrades, and insight. The world lights up more with each gem you get. But as you collect them, you lose your humanity and even your grasp on reality, or arguably in typical Lovecraftian style, your sanity. This is shown visually with your hand slowly transforming into pulsing energy that kind of hurts to look at. But more interestingly, as the game gets more complicated, more and more of it has to be played in your head by necessity. Devil Daggers uses synesthesia and that sense of oneness with the game as sort of a metaphor for attaining hidden arcane knowledge. By the time you enter high-level play, that additional insight into the world has turned into a mess of pixels. This isn't me playing, by the way, but a replay of one of the current high scores. Can you tell what's going on? Yeah, I can't either. Yet this player survives because the game is being played in his head by sound cues and spatial processing almost exclusively. This player is literally seeing beyond what we can see visually, and that's kind of neat as a sort of ludic metaphor. In both In the Kingdom and Devil Daggers, players become nothing more than weapons as punishment for their transgressions. But the two games convey this same concept completely differently. I chose this game to kick off Halloween because when you touch the Devil Dagger, you are fated to die, and it's really only a question of how much of a horror you'll become along the way. Anyways, happy Halloween season. We're just getting started.